Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you for you folks for being here. Please come on in and have a seat. So I'm going to talk about the dwarf pine plains on Long Island, what's so special, and some data also, because I'm a scientist and we're kind of addicted to data, I guess. So here's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, what exactly are dwarf pines, and what are the dwarf pine plains, and where are they? Are there other dwarf forests? What's life like for a dwarf pine? It's pretty tough. And then why are there dwarf pines? So that's what we all want to know. Why do we have dwarf pines? And I will talk about some data from a long-term census that I carried out with a lot of help and some experimental work after the big 1995 fires. Spoiler alert, the dwarf pines are still pretty mysterious. We know a lot more about them, but wow, they're so cool and so mysterious, and there's a lot left to understand. There were probably many similarities, but also many differences with dwarf pines in other sites and other systems, and also with other dwarf tree species. And then finally, I'll end up with why should we care? Why should we preserve the dwarf pines? Why should we study them? And this is like my little rant or philosophy, but I think it applies to a lot of the other topics, organisms, and systems that we have been hearing about and will be hearing about during this conference. Is so what, right? We all kind of know so what, but I think it's worth being more specific about why do we care, why should we know, why should we study them, and why should we preserve them. So first of all, what exactly are the dwarf pines and the dwarf pine plains? So the first thing about the dwarf pines is, not surprisingly, they are short. They are really short. They're from 3 to 15 feet at maturity. So you can have, there are some spots which have trees that are this tall and they're 60 years old. That's pretty amazing. Another thing to point out, a lot of people are not so clear about what species they are. They're the same species as the pitch pines. So Pinus rigida, pitch pines, they're the same species as the tall pitch pines that are the important dominant species in the pine barrens. On Long Island, the dwarf pines grow on sandy, acidic, nutrient-poor soil. They grow on the glacial outwash plain. There are a number of other species that are found on the dwarf pine plains, and they're not very many. It's not a very species-rich habitat. There are a small number of species, but many of them are very rare or unique to this site. So they're unique to this special place, but it's not very species diverse. So one little thing I have about that is you hear a lot in conservation circles about preserving rich biodiversity sites, biodiversity hotspots, and I'm all for that, but I don't want us to neglect some of the biodiversity poor spots that may still be very unique, have special species that have they're all native species, only native species are growing there, and they're really special and wonderful. So we shouldn't only preserve the biodiversity hotspots. Historically, they had frequent fires. In recent, the last decades, of course, they have had much less frequent fires. They're very highly dependent on mycorrhizae. Here are some of these are some pictures of some other species. This is Pine Barrens golden heather, Hudsonia ericoides, this cool little weird plant species. There are a number of Lepidoptera and other insect species. Of course, you've probably all heard of the buck moth, but this one is a hair streak butterfly. There are other butterflies and moths as well. You can see how tall the dwarf pines are. This is me many years ago standing in front of some dwarf pines, and this is a graduate student who was working with me standing in another site with a recovering stand of dwarf pines. Okay. They grow really, really slowly. They are small and they grow slowly. So these are some cores, or some discs really. So this is an ordinary stature pine. This is a little pencil, little mechanical pencil, and you can see the rings. You can sort of see the rings on the dwarf pine. This one is probably quite a bit older than that one. They are really, really amazing, tiny little growth rings. And here are some close-ups. You can see how big they are by my wedding ring, which I happen to have handy when I took this picture. And you can also see they have very thick bark, and they kind of tend to be asymmetrical. This is a core, and you can kind of see the rings. There's many, many rings here, and this is a scale of 1 inch. So they grow very slowly. They also have other unique characteristics. They have this amazing bonsai-like growth form. This is actually a picture of a dwarf pine, that's a dwarf pitch pine that's in the Shawangunks. I'll mention more about that site later, but they have twisted, very strange, we in the business would call it loss of apical dominance, but it's a lot more wonderful than that. They're just this strange, twisty, amazing kind of growth form. They have mostly serotinous cones. Here is some picture of some serotinous cones. They open only after fire, so ordinary pitch pines in the taller pine barrens take about, from the time that the cones are first fertilized till seeds are ready, it's almost 2 years. At the end of that time, the cones open up and the seeds fall down, and maybe they'll get a chance to survive and maybe not. That's the ordinary open cones of regular pitch pines. But for serotinous cones, which are characteristic of the dwarf pines, these cones only open after fire. So the seeds are produced and they stay on the tree, sometimes for many, many years until there's a fire. When there's a fire, all the cones open up all together. The ground has been cleared by the fire. The seeds are shed in abundance on the ground, and there's a much better chance for the survival and establishment of these little pine seedlings. Like tall pines, pitch pines have the capacity to resprout after fire. Here's some resprouting. So they have little growth buds underneath the bark, and sometimes after fire they resprout, but many times they don't. That's just characteristic of this species, and this is a little trail through the dwarf pines. The really important message is the dwarf pine plains are a very tiny part of the pine barrens, and the pine barrens themselves are a threatened ecosystem. So this is a threatened and tiny part of a threatened and diminished ecosystem. And the dwarf pine plains have only local protection, which is kind of astounding. So there's town protection, there's a little bit of county protection, but there's not even state protection, not to mention there's no federal protection for them, for the dwarf pine plains. Where are they? Okay, so here we are. This is eastern Long Island, and this is the part of the map. And this little part is the dwarf pine plains, and these are some of the other preserved areas, mostly local preserved areas. The only federal one, I think, no, the only New York State one, there's no federal ones here. Wertheim is federal, I guess, but the only state one is Rocky Point, which has pine barrens in the southern part, but no dwarf pines. Anyway, so here are the dwarf pines, which go, the Sunrise Highway goes right through them, through the northern part. And this is Quogue Preserve over here, so there's some dwarf pines there as well. And this is a close-up. This is the airport. This is that small West Hampton airport where tragically someone was very recently crashed and killed. So the airport also took up part of the dwarf pines. This is the interchange between Sunrise and Route 31. And this is the dwarf pines here, and this is the intermediate stature pines, the transition pines. Okay, so let's get a bigger perspective. Where else could you find dwarf pitch pines? So dwarf pitch pines are found in a few other places, a few other very small, very limited places. The first one, and of course we think the best one, is the Long Island dwarf pine plains in West Hampton. There is another New York State site in Minnewaska, the Minnewaska dwarf pines, which is a state park at the top of a mountain. That's west of New Paltz. There are two more famous, among botanists anyway, more famous dwarf pine sites. They're called the pygmy pine sites in New Jersey, in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, which are much larger than the Long Island Pine Barrens, but they're still, the dwarf pines there are still very small. They're still pitch pines, they still look quite similar. And then there are some other much more obscure sites, some of which I found just in putting this talk together. I didn't know about all of them. There's one place in Massachusetts that's called Mount Everett, and then a couple of other places that on hiking websites, they talk about dwarf pines being there, but I've never seen this in any of the botanical or ecological papers talking about the dwarf pines. So we have to, that's why the question mark, but that would be cool to find out more there. So these are all mountain sites, and this is a mountain site, and then these are deep, sandy, outwash plains. So there's two different kinds, very different kinds of places where these dwarf pines are found: cold, windy mountaintops with shallow, rocky soil, and then the outwash plains with deep, nutrient-poor, sandy soils. The other species that are found growing with the dwarf pines in these different sites are somewhat similar. They're all low in species numbers, and they have some species in common, but they also are quite different. They're really somewhat different ecosystems with, for example, different scrub oak species occur in the New Jersey dwarf pines and the pygmy pines there that don't grow here, and we have species that don't grow there. So different distinct species in each of these sites. Pitch pine barrens themselves, so the larger ecosystem of the pine barrens, are found in a very wide range of habitats. They're places that have differences in soil pH, in moisture and depth, and over a very wide range of elevations. So here are two other dwarf pine sites. So this is Mount Everett in a very southwestern corner of Massachusetts. This is the Minnewaska dwarf pines, which I've seen, and that's in just west of New Paltz in Minnewaska State Park in the Shawangunk Mountains. And this is a picture of the Minnewaska dwarf pines, and you can see it's on a mountaintop. So it's a really different kind of a habitat than we have here. Another thing that's really striking to me about this map is this is from the New York State Park site, and these are the green is the protected New York State lands, and of course the Adirondacks is the biggest area, but look at how, tiny, a few teensy little dots here on Long Island. We are not very protected. We have a lot of people and an amazing amount of natural history, as you can see from this conference, but a lot of it is not at all protected, and certainly not protected at the higher governmental levels of state and federal government. So it's like a little bit of protected stuff, and then a lot of people in development. Okay. So what about dwarf trees in general? Well, dwarf trees of any species are very rare and very limited in nature. There are only a few tree species which have dwarf forms, that have tall trees and then have some kind of dwarf form. And they're always small, they're always very limited in area. They're always really special, right? This is a really special, unique kind of a thing, kind of a occurrence. Some of the other tree species that have dwarf forms, which are often conifers, but not always conifers. One of the ones that's kind kind of cool are the dwarf bald cypresses that occur in both the Everglades and the Panhandle of Florida. In the ecological literature, one of the most studied and most famous is the pygmy forest and elfin forest in Mendocino and some other sites in California which have, so this is a taxodium species, these dwarf bald cypresses. These are cupressa species. They also have some dwarf oaks there, and they have very strange soil, and the causes, the ecological factors leading to the establishment of these dwarf trees of other species are very, very different than what we have here in Long Island. They're not caused by the same things. They're also, something I don't know anything about at all, but seems super cool and would be very wonderful to see, is there are supposedly high elevation tropical forests, dwarf and elfin forests in Sumatra, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. These are tropical tree species. They're not conifers, and they have these dwarf forms, which sounds pretty amazing. There are a few other pine species that also have, besides pitch pine, there are a few other pines that have dwarf forms. But in any case, dwarf forms of tall trees are rare. They don't occur in many species. Only a few species have them, and they only occur in small, limited, very, very specific sites, and they're probably ecologically, genetically, and so on, they probably have very different causes. They're probably different explanations for why these trees are dwarf in different places. How much of the dwarf pine plains is left? Not enough. So this is the original extent of the Pine Barrens, and those Pine Barrens they used to go all the way up from Maine, way down into the mountains in the southern states, and they were dominated by pitch pines, oaks, blueberries, and other species in the Ericaceae. Somewhat different species in different places, but a lot of these are gone. A lot of these areas have been developed, and in other ways, the Pine Barrens have not been maintained. But in all of this big extent, there were still only these very, very few sites that ever had dwarf pines. So the dwarf pines, it wasn't like they were all over the place and then wiped out. They were never found in very many places. So the dwarf pine plains on Long Island are about 290 acres, which are legally preserved. There are about 1,300 acres that remain. So some of the remaining dwarf pines are not legally protected, and they're in fragmented parcels in different spots. They originally were apparently about 2,500 acres, and their global rarity rank is G1, G2. The state rank is S1, meaning there's not a whole lot of them. That's basically it. They are in trouble. There's not a lot of them. They're just like, whatever. Value what you have, because there's hardly any of it left. Okay. All right, so general statement, which probably most people attending a Long Island Natural History Conference would agree with. Long Island Pine Barrens are valuable ecologically and environmentally, for biodiversity preservation, for water recharge, and for human recreation and well-being. Not everybody on Long Island or in the country would agree with that, but probably most of us see eye to eye on that. And these are just some pictures of some of the wonderful things you can see if you are looking at plants in the Long Island Pine Barrens. And we've been hearing about some of those not quite as interesting organisms, the ones that move around and swim and stuff, but they're still pretty cool, right? Okay, so in August 1995, many of you will remember that we had severe fires in the Long Island Pine Barrens that were so hot and fast-moving, they jumped over Sunrise Highway, and you can barely see, these are the firefighters wearing those reflective things, so you can see how tall those flame lengths were. This is a very hot, very severe fire that got national attention because it threatened the Hamptons, so it got a lot of attention. Yeah. And this is an aerial photo of soon after those fires. The fire started right up here on the ring road around one of the campuses of Suffolk Community College, and you could just see how that fire spread and how patchy it was. There were very, very severely burned areas and then more lightly burned areas, so ecologically very interesting. And this is the Coast Guard housing area that was saved. Amazingly, in this big fire, no one was killed, thankfully. And this is the airport that was also saved. And you can see there are unburned spots where the fire was stopped. But this included the dwarf pines. So this part of the dwarf pines was burned, and a lot of area of tall pines also was burned. So this is a picture of right after the fire, the dwarf pine plains. And this is the edge of the dwarf pine plains, and that is Marilyn Jordan's son. Some of you may know Marilyn Jordan, who is now retired but used to work for the Long Island Nature Conservancy. And you can see there was a fire break that stopped the fire over here, but very, very vast area. But very soon after the fire, scrub oak soon began to resprout. And this is my former student, Max Taub, back when both of us were a lot younger. He's now a professor at Southwestern University. And you can see here, these are the dwarf pines. You can see their weird, tangled, kind of bonsai-like growth form because the leaves are all gone and everything is cleared. So you can see this strange growth form. You can see some of the serotinous cones which opened, and all of this green is resprouting from the roots of the scrub oaks, Quercus ilicifolia, but most of the dwarf pines did not resprout, and even the ones that did resprout, the sprouts died. So the mature dwarf pines died. That was like no more dwarf pines in it was about 20 or 25% of the dwarf pine plains. So we were very worried about it. Here was a special area. There had been this long-term fire suppression, very hot, very severe fire, and the adults were killed. So what happened next? Well, we had a bunch of questions. So here's a burned dwarf pine. You can see again this amazing cool growth form. And these are serotinous cones that opened after the fire. So you can see they pop open and lots of seeds were shed to the ground. Here were the questions we asked. So I started a research project then that went on for quite a few years. First question is, would the pitch pines regenerate in general? The second question is, would the dwarf pitch pines be decimated by the severity of the fire, and would the little pines come back? How long would it take for new seedlings to reach the ability to produce new seed? So we were worried about, well, if they did come back and they did start growing and there was another fire, then if they were too young and hadn't produced seeds yet, there would be no more place to get the seeds from. Were the growth, survival, and reproduction of trees different in dwarf and tall sites, and were there genetic differences between the dwarf and the tall pines? So regeneration began in the spring of 1996. The fire was in the fall of, the very early fall, late summer, early fall of 1995. By the following spring, you can see all this burnt stuff on the ground, and there are these little tiny pitch pine seedlings coming up. Oh, so cool. So what we did was we tagged, this was really crazy, we tagged about 7,000 seedlings in dwarf, intermediate, and normal stature sites. This took a big crew, and we followed their fates until 2009 when basically I ran out of funding. Most seedlings germinated in the year immediately following the fire. So this is on dwarf sites. Lots and lots of seedlings germinated, and just a few afterwards. But if you look up very close, this is on a log scale, there was still some germination up to 11 years after the fire. Life is tough. So what is life like for a dwarf pine? It's really tough. So most of the seedlings, about 75% of them in the dwarf pines, died very young. So tremendous mortality very quickly, which then started to level off. Less mortality in the tall and intermediate sites, but they started to die off after they grew big enough to start crowding each other. So all kinds of interesting population ecology was going on here. This is what it looked like in 2007. So these are the dwarf pines growing back, and you can see, yeah, a lot of them really grew back. The earliest reproduction started, it's like the world's record for a tree. So it started between 2 years and 4 years old. This is in 2007. These are some serotinous cones. They're all serotinous in the dwarf pines. This is really amazing. Trees usually take much, much, much longer to produce, to reproduce, and they were producing cones very, very young. The first cones that were produced in the dwarf sites were produced at age 4, in the tall sites at age 2. However, more of the dwarfs reproduced sooner compared to the tall sites. So the tall sites, by 2009, only 10% of them, of the trees we had tagged that were still alive, had reproduced. In the dwarf sites, almost half had reproduced by 2009. Okay, so why are the dwarf pines dwarf? We did a reciprocal transplant experiment, which means that we took seeds from tall sites and from dwarf sites, and then we planted them in tall sites and dwarf sites to see how much of the difference was due to the environment and how much of the differences were due to who your parents were, what your genetics were. So in 1997, and then we repeated this in 1999, we collected seeds from these dwarf sites, an intermediate site, and a normal stature site, all unburned, of course, because we had to get the seeds. And then we germinated the seeds in a greenhouse, and we transplanted them from the dwarf, intermediate, and tall sites into burned sites. So the reason this was done then was I felt it was the only chance these seedlings would have to grow and reach maturity, because if you put them into an unburned site, it's too much competition for them. They can't survive. So here we had this chance to carry out a large reciprocal transplant experiment in the field because the ground had been all opened and there was plenty of resources, availability, sunlight, and whatever for those transplanted seedlings to grow. So here are those abbreviations: dwarf sites, a transitional site, and a normal stature site. Normal stature meaning tall, but no trees on Long Island are tall, so I call them normal stature. Okay, so what determines the height? If the height is determined by who your parents are, then the offspring of, by logic, the offspring of normal stature parents will be tall, and the offspring of dwarf parents will be dwarf. But if height is determined by where you're growing, the offspring of normal stature parents and dwarf stature parents will be tall when growing in tall sites and small when growing in the dwarf pine plains. Same thing with reproduction. Does it depend on who your parents are or where you're growing? Or, since this is ecology, is it more complex and subtle? Yes, it's a little more complex and subtle. All right, so here's some data. This is the height in centimeters, 12 years after these seedlings were transplanted. Here are the conclusions. There are very large differences among the growth environments. So this is one of the dwarf sites. This is another dwarf site, intermediate and normal stature site. And look at how much taller the transplanted seedlings were in the normal stature site. These are the dwarf, one of the dwarf, the offspring of parents from one of the dwarf sites, another dwarf site, intermediate, and normal stature site. You can see there's a little bit of difference between a little bit of difference is determined by who the parents of these seedlings were. These bars are a little bit different, but not very different. The biggest difference by far is the place that you're growing. So the differences among seed sources exist, but the environment is what's really important in determining growth rate. So a small contribution from parents. There are probably real genetic differences, but the overwhelming determinant of how tall and how fast you grow is the environment. But that's a very different story for reproduction. So this is I have lots of data on this. I'll just show this little bit. This is the percent of trees that had cones at 12 years. This is in dwarf site 2, dwarf site 1, the intermediate and normal stature site. So many more offspring of dwarf parents. This is the first bar. These are dwarf parents. This is dwarf parents, dwarf parents. These are the tall and normal stature parents, dwarf parents, dwarf parents. So in all of the sites, dwarf parents started reproducing sooner. They produced many more cones, and many more of the seedlings that were the offspring of dwarf parents reproduced. And they also, the dwarf offspring started reproducing at much smaller sizes than the tall ones. However, the environment also had an effect. The plants grew much more. They had many more resources in the normal stature site, apparently, and they grew much faster, and they produced more cones more quickly. Okay, so you're wondering, is this all soil? No, it's not all soil. This is why this is so mysterious. The dwarf and normal stature sites are only slightly different. Their soils are really, really similar. Very, very slight differences, with a little tiny bit less miserable soil in the normal stature sites and really, really miserable soil in the dwarf sites. But the intermediate site is really different. The intermediate site has much more silt, clay, organic matter, and nutrients. It also has more aluminum, which is toxic. pH explains nothing. All of the sites have low pH. Aluminum is very low in the dwarf and normal stature sites. Fire may be important in other ways, but it doesn't explain any of these results because there was no fire after we planted them, so that's not explaining this. Maybe it's soil, but I don't know. It seems kind of weird because there are very, very small differences between the soils in the dwarf and normal stature sites. Okay, so going back to the questions, would the pitch pines regenerate? Yes. Would the dwarf pines regenerate? Yes, but not as many trees were reestablished as had been there before. The density was lower, and fire is almost certainly needed to preserve both the health of those ecosystems, but also the dwarf growth forms, that strange morphology. Did the little pines come back? Yes, they did. I was and am very happy to say yes. How long did it take for new seedlings to reach the ability to reproduce? Some by 2 to 4 years, but many of them not by 13 years. So it's still kind of slow, but certainly there were many of them that were starting to reproduce. Were the growth, survival, and reproduction different in dwarf and tall sites? Very, 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 very different. Are there genetic differences between dwarf and tall trees? Yes, but they're pretty subtle. The differences that are due to the environment in a lot of ways are much greater than the differences that are due to genetics. And my conclusion from this is my conservation conclusion is the dwarf pine sites are really special, as well as the dwarf pines themselves. So saving the seeds, if we destroyed the sites, but save the seeds, that's not going to save the dwarf pines, and it's not going to save the dwarf pine barrens, the dwarf pine plains. They're both special. You need the seed source, you need the genetics. It's a lot of mystery, a lot of really interesting stuff here, but you need the sites too. Okay, so what makes the dwarf pines dwarf? It's pretty mysterious. Soils, fire, and genetics play a role. Water relations and mycorrhizae are probably very important, but no one has looked at them yet. Pitch pines, in general, have the capacity, they have the biological capacity to greatly alter their growth rates and growth forms. Different dwarf pine sites in New Jersey, upstate, Massachusetts, and so on are probably dwarf due to somewhat different factors. So apparently aluminum in the soil is a factor in the New Jersey ones. Shallow and rocky soil and wind in the one near New Paltz. What's going on in Long Island? Still a little mysterious. We know some of the story, but not all of it. Different aspects of these dwarfs, their reproduction, their growth, their morphology may have different causes. It may not be one cause for the whole thing. Genetics are more important in reproduction. The environment is more important in growth, and probably fire plays an important role in those weird growth forms. So, and then there's another mystery, which is how can pines in such a small area surrounded by tall pines be genetically different? You all know that when the pines are reproducing, that pollen is everywhere. There's just enormous amounts of pollen flowing everywhere. So how, if they're surrounded by tall pines, do they not get just interbred with the tall pines and lose their genetic distinction? Don't know. It's so mysterious, so amazing and interesting. Okay, so finally, to wrap up, why should we care about the dwarf pine plains and the dwarf pines? Scientists often justify fundamental research by pointing out amazing and important useful applications that were unanticipated and came out of basic research. So that's one of the things you hear a lot as a scientist or maybe a member of the general public. But also the arguments for conserving natural areas are often made on the basis of useful things provided by the natural area, like preserving the water table. Those are ecosystem services. Well, what about the dwarf pine plains? Well, I have a strong statement to make here. The dwarf pine plains are, sadly, not going to create any jobs. They're not going to become a major tourist destination, and they're not going to create entrepreneurial opportunities or make anyone wealthy. They're not going to alleviate poverty. They're not going to reduce discrimination, prevent crime, or make incomes on Long Island or anywhere else more equal. They're not going to increase anyone's sex appeal, except perhaps for the buck moths and the pines themselves. And it's highly unlikely that the dwarf pines hold the key to curing cancer or increasing K-12 New York State test scores. So, does that mean they're useless? Well, no. They may add beauty, peace, wonder, and serenity to the few people who visit them. They exist for their own sake. They're rare. They're uniquely part of the natural heritage of Long Island. Without the natural world and its amazing, unique wonders, we're less human. Do we value other things that have no tangible value? Great art in museums, the artwork of one's children, the company of friends, music that you love, even if they don't make us richer, sexier, cure disease, or solve social problems. Yeah, these things intangibly enrich our lives. And the wonder at the beauty and utter strangeness of life is an antidote to ugliness and despair. So as usual, I've talked too much. I
think we have time for one question.
Yes, hi. Since the dwarf pines are more vulnerable to browsing, is there any evidence that they are less palatable than tall pines?
We did not test that, but we did do experiments with fencing off parts of the burned area to see if browsing made a big difference in the recovery of those dwarf pines, and we did not see a big difference. Now, also, after that fire, there was less browsing because there were less deer and mice and so on. Their populations were way down. They weren't there in those sites. So maybe that's not conclusive. But no, we don't know if that's the case. But that would be interesting. That's one more interesting part of the puzzle.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica.